On most days, we go in depth on a single story, but every so often we like to take a step back from our usual format and spend a bit of time gathering fresh insight and analysis from those covering world events. To help us dive into these issues, we've put together a distinguished panel of journalists. Joining us here in Washington is Afshin Molavi. He's worked for Reuters, the Washington Post and the Arab News and is currently editor of the New Silk Road Monitor. With us from New York is Lorna Shaddick. She's a correspondent for Feature Story News. My colleague Nathan King joins us here in Washington, and also with us is China Daily's chief Washington correspondent and the deputy editor of China Daily USA, Chen Weihua. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Weihua, let's start with President Xi Jinping's visit to the Middle East. He visited Iran, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. Was this visit just about trade and economic relations, or was there a bit of a diplomatic and political dimension to it?
I think you first have to realize, the Xi Jinping government is more active than previous government in terms of diplomacy. And Xi has visited 17 countries in the past year, compared actually like 10 countries paid by President Obama. So you see more active diplomacy by the Chinese leadership. And the Middle East, Chinese have always seized the traditional friendship we have, with Egypt. I remember just in the Egyptian bar in New York, the Egyptian owner would say, oh, Chinese are our brothers, so, invite me to belly dance on stage. So all these things, is long-standing. And, it's interesting when you talk about trade. China sees very differently. For example, the Silk Road, one belt or one road. China very much believe, the chaos in the Middle East, one of the solutions is development and creating jobs for these young people in the Middle East. So that's actually, one solution to sort of a stability issue. And I think, obviously, China has a huge, trade interest. Saudi being the largest and oil supplier, Iran, one of the biggest. So we all want, China very much want Middle East to be peaceful, stable, and it's, when the West sort of approach has failed,
Right. Nathan, in that vein, President Xi has invited the foreign minister of Syria, Walid al-Muallim, as well as the head of one of the Syrian opposition groups, the Syrian National Coalition, to a meeting in Beijing, an attempt to find some kind of a solution to what appears to be an intractable problem there. Is this an indication that China is actually going to engage more in this region on the political problems of the region? No one else has succeeded so far, as Weihua just pointed out.
Yeah, I think Weihua touched on it, that Beijing has now a much more presence in terms of international relations, but it doesn't take sides, and that was a key element of the Middle East visit. Xi Jinping and the rest of the Chinese leadership have good relations with Saudi Arabia and good relations with Iran. Of course, two of the main proxies involved in the Syrian civil war. So when you actually meet with the opposition and the government in Beijing and you don't take sides, that gives extra clout. But China's not doing this on its own. It's a permanent member of the Security Council. It is very much invested in finding a solution to this. Great power rivalry divided the UN at the beginning of this war, but it's been going on for 5 years now. And there is a sense of urgency, especially since the last United Nations General Assembly, of trying to get all the parties together. And China is playing its part as an honest broker in the region. We'll wait and see. As we know, the peace talks aren't going that well. Not everyone's at the table, but all these efforts are being coordinated between the capitals of the permanent 5 members.
Lorna, what is your view? Is there a feeling that China is now taking a more vigorous role in the Middle East? Up to now, it's been the United States largely that's led the international effort to solve many of those problems in the Middle East.
Well, I think there is certainly that view, and it's interesting if you look at the statistics, and several American media outlets have pointed this out, that actually Xi Jinping travelled to more countries last year than Barack Obama, 14 to his 11. And really there is an attempt by Xi Jinping to put China out there on the world map, and the Middle East, of course, is no exception. Worth pointing out, though, of course, that the Middle East is crucial for China, given that it is the world's largest oil importer, and over half of its crude oil does come from the Middle East region. And so So, of course, it's no accident that that Xi Jinping is attempting to make inroads in that area. But the timing is very important. It's interesting that Xi Jinping went to these countries after those sanctions on Iran had been lifted, thus avoiding ruffling the feathers of any Western powers, which he might have done before had he gone earlier. So he's being very careful in that respect. But it's also interesting that, of course, Saudi Arabia is growing in its alienation from the United States. And I think Xi Jinping got a much warmer welcome in Riyadh than he would have done before that alienation started.
Afshin, is China great taste in ties and shirts, by the way?
You are matching, aren't you?
Great combination.
We didn't call each other ahead of time.
Is China seen by many countries and groups in the Middle East as more of an honest broker than, say, the United States? I mean, we know the United States is seen by many as having too much support for Israel or for Saudi Arabia or the military leadership in Egypt. So does that put China in a better place to help negotiate these problems?
I think China certainly has an opportunity to negotiate and to play a broker role, but particularly between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two regional heavyweights, and as Nathan noted, who are fighting proxy wars across the region. China certainly has the ability to do so. The question is, are they going to want to invest the kind of heavy diplomacy required to do so? I mean, the Iran-Saudi Arabia conflict right now is an intense one, and one might even say intractable one that can probably only be solved when the two capitals decide to solve it. And it's going to require some pretty intense diplomacy. And is Xi Jinping prepared to do that? Because one of the things I noticed in the number of countries he had visited, I wondered why it took him so long to visit the Middle East. After all, as Lorna noted, more than 50% of China's oil imports come from the Middle East, North Africa region, headed for 70% by the year 2030. A very important energy relationship with Saudi Arabia. But the optics of the Saudi Arabia visit and the Egypt visit were extraordinary. As soon as Xi Jinping's airplane entered Saudi airspace, it was escorted by 4 F-15s. And as soon as he entered airspace in Egypt, escorted by 8 F-15s. So this was an extraordinary visit, and those kind of symbols matter.
Nathan, let's move on to Iran after that nuclear deal. That deal is now being implemented, of course.
Yeah.
Is it all going according to plan?
I don't think anyone thought it would be this good. It's quite incredible how everyone, when they signed on to the Joint Plan of Action, that everyone stuck to their guns. And in fact, Iran has shipped most of its material out of the country, dismantled centrifuges, disabled the potential plutonium reactor ahead of schedule. There has been a huge amount of cooperation between the 5 permanent members of the Security Council and Germany, or the EU 3+3, and Iran on this. And we've seen it in other areas as well, which is quite incredible. When those 10 sailors found themselves in Iranian waters, they weren't held for days, as happened before, and would normally happen. They were released within 24 hours. Then we got this prisoner swap, as this deal just got implemented. This is quite incredible. The Washington and Iran now speak to each other, it looks like, more regularly than Washington and Saudi Arabia. And of course, all the other players involved have become much warmer to Iran as well. Now, China has always had warm relations with Tehran, but you can see it with the Europeans as well. The big question now is, what if something goes wrong? Because is everyone going to turn around and isolate Iran again? It's going to be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle.
Afshin, the Iranians, of course, have wasted no time in making their presence felt. Right after this deal was signed, President Hassan Rouhani has visited Italy. He's visited France. He's been to the Vatican as well, met the Pope. He's busy building this economic relationship with Europe. In fact, Iran has put in an order for something like 100 aeroplanes from Airbus. It's doing business with Peugeot.
Not Boeing's, Trump said. Trump was angry.
Well, that is my question, actually. The United States, Afshin, was not on his shopping list. Does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me right now, and I'll tell you why. I think there's still a whole range of residual sanctions in place that still make it difficult to do business deals with Iran if you're a U.S. company. And there's also a little thing called the U.S. presidential election coming up. And Republican candidates have all kind of one after another said that they would like to rethink the Iran nuclear deal. And that kind of talk is heard very well in corporate boardrooms in the United States. And if you're going to put serious investment dollars in Iran, you don't want a year from now to have the nuclear deal be turned back in some way, shape, or form. So it doesn't surprise me. But I think what we will see from the U.S. companies is anything that can be transactional, the sale of airplanes, the sale of goods, the sale of parts and that sort of thing, I think we'll see happen. But when it comes to heavy foreign direct investment, the U.S. companies are going to stay on the sidelines, particularly the energy companies.
Lorna, what is the likelihood of something like that happening? Is it likely that a future president in the United States could tear up this agreement and just say, as far as we're concerned, it doesn't exist anymore? I mean, several Republican candidates have already been talking about that, saying that we're not going to honor this agreement if we become president.
They have indeed. In fact, it's featured quite heavily on the campaign trail. But I think it would be practically pretty difficult, not least because the sanctions which brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place have now been lifted. So the US has lost that leverage that it had beforehand. And it's also relatively high risk because in dissolving that deal, you effectively set off a race for Iran to develop a nuclear bomb before any new sanctions could be imposed. So it could be a pretty high risk and dangerous strategy. Nonetheless, it's true that a Republican president with a majority in Congress could potentially scrap that deal, introduce new sanctions on Iran, or revive the ones that we've just seen lifted. But essentially, I think it's more likely than rather than dissolving it, perhaps a Republican president might try to start building up a case against Iran by sort of trying to look for, catch it out, cheating on the deal in some way, or dragging its feet over implementation. That is a more likely scenario than scrapping it altogether, which, as I say, could be a much more high-risk move.
Right, well, China and Iran have always been on friendly terms. In fact, Beijing has stood by Iran even at the worst of times. How do you see this relationship grow from here?
I think, because some of the sanctions actually targeted the Chinese companies doing business with Iran. So this means the Chinese companies can be free of doing business. I mean, actually, I think if you think, I just want to reflect on what the other said, China has been an honest broker. I mean, whether in the Iran nuclear deal, when, there was a sort of a certain part of a reactor hit a deadlock, it was the Chinese who provided sort of a wisdom to move it ahead. I mean, China talked to President Assad in Syria and also invited the rebel leader to Beijing. So, I mean, I think we are trusted. So that means, when Iran is doing business with the rest of the world, I mean, they're going to trust Chinese more, I mean, rather than the US or maybe the European countries.
I think it's also worth pointing out that when it comes to foreign policy, the Iran deal is one of the few areas in which the US has managed to work successfully, both with China and with Russia. So if it were to be scrapped or rethought in any way, then Washington and a future Republican president could really risk the relationship with both of those countries as well. They may not care about that, but it's certainly a fact diplomatically that it could be a very risky move on that score as well.